This video was created by the Brazilian storyteller Giovanni Kelvin. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more incredible survival stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and support the work. Before we begin, if this story moves you the way it moved me telling it, hit that like button, drop a comment below and subscribe. Stories like this one deserve to be heard. Now let's go. 96 days. That's how long it takes for a man to understand that everything he thought mattered doesn't. The night it all started, Ethan Cole had everything the world told him he should want. He stood on the upper deck of the Horizon, his 180-foot private yacht, with a glass of champagne in one hand and 40 of Seattle's most powerful people surrounding him. The Pacific sunset bled orange and gold across the water, and somewhere below deck, a jazz quartet played a song nobody was really listening to. They were all too busy congratulating each other. Tonight, Ethan had announced the merger that would make Cole Industries the most dominant tech investment firm on the West Coast. At 38, he was exactly where he'd planned to be. "Congratulations, darling." Victoria Ashford appeared at his side, sliding her hand around his arm with the practiced ease of a woman who knew exactly how to position herself in a room. She was stunning in red silk, diamonds catching the fading light, dark hair pinned with the precision of someone who understood the difference between beauty and performance. Victoria had always understood that difference. She'd built her entire life on it. "To us," she murmured, her lips brushing his cheek. "To the merger," he said, lifting his glass. She smiled. He didn't notice the edge in it. He wouldn't notice it for a long time. 3 hours later, the storm hit without mercy and without warning. The captain had tried to tell him, "There's weather moving in, Mr. Cole, we should consider heading back." And Ethan had dismissed the concern the way he dismissed most things that inconvenienced him. Briefly and completely. They were fine. The yacht could handle anything. They would stay the course. He was wrong on all 3 counts. The first wave came at midnight, sending champagne glasses sliding off tables and guests stumbling across the deck. The second wave was the kind that removes choices. Ethan remembered the sound. A roar like something geological, something that predated every human structure ever built, and then the impact, and then the cold, and then nothing. The water was black and absolute. He didn't know how long he swam. He didn't know how he found the section of hull floating in the debris field, buoyant enough to hold his weight. He didn't know how many hours the current carried him, half-conscious and hypothermic before the shore appeared. Pale sand and dark volcanic rock, lit by a moon that had no interest in his problems. He woke to birds. Loud, indifferent birds. The sun was already high. His body was a catalog of pain he didn't have words for. His suit was ruined, his phone was drowned, and the horizon showed nothing. No ships, no Coast Guard, no reassuring silhouette of civilization. He was alone. Day 1. The man who had managed a portfolio of $2 billion lay in the sand and attempted to remember every survival fact he'd ever encountered. It wasn't much. He knew that fresh water was critical. He knew that shelter mattered. He knew that fire was necessary. What he didn't know, what his entire life had not prepared him for, was the weight of silence, not external silence. The island was relentlessly alive. Wind through palms, waves on rock, insects at every hour, birds that screamed at dawn like they were personally offended by sunrise. No, the silence was internal. The constant velocity of his life, calls, decisions, strategies, demands, appointments, had gone entirely quiet. And in that quiet, things he'd been outrunning for years began to catch up. He found fresh water on day 3, fruit on day 5. He built a shelter from palm fronds that collapsed twice before holding. He burned his hands learning to make fire and succeeded on the 8th attempt. He was, as he had always been, a fast learner. The island was simply a faster teacher. By day 15 he had a routine. By day 30 he had something that unsettled him far more than hunger. Clarity. He thought about his father, who had died during a board meeting Ethan hadn't attended. He thought about his college roommate Daniel, who had stopped returning calls 2 years ago after too many canceled plans. He thought about Victoria and felt, with a slowness that was almost peaceful, that he didn't miss her. He missed having someone beside him at events. He missed the function of her presence. He didn't miss her. That distinction had never occurred to him before. It felt important in a way he couldn't yet name. By day 60, Ethan had mapped the island, roughly 3 miles long, 1 mile wide, shaped like a crescent. He'd cataloged edible plants by trial and survivable error. He'd tracked the tides and learned which low-lying areas flooded at high water. He'd built a fire signal on the North Beach, visible from the air, and he added to it every day because it was the only forward motion available to him. He did not find the island beautiful. He wasn't there yet. On the 80th day, he found cloth tied to a branch, faded, frayed, not from the yacht. Someone else had been here. He told himself it was old. Someone from years ago. On the 89th day, he found the shelter. It was deep in the jungle, more sophisticated than anything he'd built. The roof was layered palm fronds, angled precisely to shed rain. The floor was a raised platform of woven branches dry despite recent storms. The fire pit was small and efficient, positioned to direct smoke upward through a deliberate gap in the canopy. The ashes were not cold, not by a long way. Something moved in his chest that had been still for a very long time. Someone is here. On day 96, he found the footprints, small, pressed into the soft earth near the freshwater stream. They led east into the thickest part of the jungle, toward a rocky ridge he'd never bothered to cross because the terrain had seemed impassable. He crossed it now. The ridge looked down over the island's eastern cove, a hidden bay, protected and calm, invisible from the North Beach where he'd spent 3 months staring at nothing. He stopped at the ridgeline, his breath arrested in his chest. Below him, on the flat rocks at the water's edge, sat a woman. She had her back to him. Her hair was light brown, long and wind-tangled, falling past her shoulders. Her clothes had been mended many times, a faded blue shirt, cut-off shorts, sandals lashed together with vine. She sat perfectly still, watching the horizon with a quality of attention that Ethan had only ever seen from people who had learned patience from something that cost them. He started down the rocky slope. Too fast, too loud. She heard him when he was still 20 feet away. She moved faster than he expected. By the time he reached the rocks, she was on her feet with a long piece of sharpened wood held level and steady in both hands, her stance balanced and entirely without panic. "Stop," she said, not a request. Ethan stopped. He raised both hands. "I'm not going to hurt you. My yacht sank in a storm. I've been on this island 96 days. He held her gaze. "You're the first person I've seen." She didn't lower the spear. Her eyes were blue, sharp and assessing and unimpressed in a way he was entirely unaccustomed to. She looked at him the way a scientist looks at an unexpected data point, neither pleased nor displeased, simply working out what it meant. 96 days, she repeated. "Yes. Impressive." The word carried no admiration. "I've been here 412. The number landed like a physical impact. 412 days. He stared. He couldn't help it. "You've been here for over a year," he finally said. 412 days, she confirmed. And then, for the first time, the smallest possible shift in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one. "You've been on my island for 96 of those days without finding me." A pause. "Either you're a very poor explorer, or I'm very good at not being found." She lowered the spear. "Not fully, but enough." "Lily Harper," she said. Not an offer, just a statement of fact like latitude and longitude. "Ethan Cole, I know who you are." She turned back to the horizon, apparently reassured that he was not an immediate threat. "I had a satellite phone when I first arrived. I did my research before the battery died. CEO of Coal Industries. Forbes Top 50. Private yacht. A beat. Former yacht owner. Emphasis on former. He should have been stung. He wasn't. How are you still alive?" he asked. "A year and a half alone. Marine biologist," she said simply. "Coastal survival was part of my doctoral training. Beyond that," she glanced back at him over her shoulder, "I'm stubborn." 412 days, he said again, still unable to fully house the number. "Don't romanticize it," she said. "I wasn't." "You're doing that thing people do when they hear a large number. You're turning it into something meaningful, isn't it?" She was quiet for a moment. "It's just time," she said. "It passes whether you're counting it or not." The sun was moving west. The temperature would drop in a few hours. "There's a rescue signal on the North Beach," Ethan said. "Rocks and debris, large enough to be visible from a search aircraft. If you help me add to it." "I know about your signal." The sentence stopped him cold. "You know about it?" "Yes." "How long have you known?" "A beat. About 40 days." He stared at her. She was still watching the horizon with the same focused, unreadable calm. "You watched me build it," he said slowly. "You watched me struggling alone for 40 days, and you didn't." "I had reasons," she said, quiet, final. The kind of tone that closes a door without slamming it. Not defensive, not apologetic, just Closed. The way a person sounds when their reasons are the kind that require a long time to explain and even longer to understand. The kind that have real weight to them. The sky was going pink and gold over the western water. The hidden cove held the colors longer than the North Beach ever had, sheltered from wind, the surface nearly still, the light doing something extraordinary to the dark rock faces. Ethan looked at this impossible woman standing at the edge of the Pacific with a sharpened stick and 412 days behind her eyes, and felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Curiosity. Genuine, unstrategic curiosity. Not about what she could offer him, or what problem she could solve, or what angle she represented in a deal. Just, who are you? Whatever her reasons were, they mattered. And on this island, in the middle of nowhere, with no meetings and no portfolio and no identity except man who survived, he was finally in a position to find out. The woman who chose the island. She didn't invite him to stay. She also didn't tell him to leave, which Ethan was learning, was essentially the same thing as an invitation when it came to Lily Harper. He spent that first night back at his own shelter on the north side, the one he'd built over 3 months, which now felt distinctly amateur compared to her setup, and at first light, he crossed the ridge again with the focused energy of a man who had been handed a new project. Lily was already awake, crouched over her fire, boiling water in a container she'd fashioned from a salvaged fuel canister, cut and reshaped with considerable precision. She didn't look up when he arrived. "You're going to want water," she said. "There was a bacteria bloom upstream 3 days ago. You need to boil everything." He stopped. "I've been drinking from that stream unbothered for 3 months." "I know. You got lucky." She handed him a container of clean boiled water without meeting his eyes. "Luck has a limited supply." He took it. "Thank you. It's not a favor," she said. "A sick person on this island is a liability." "Warm welcome," he said dryly. For the first time she looked directly at him, and there it was again, that almost smile that didn't quite commit to itself. "I wasn't expecting company. Neither was I." The morning passed in a kind of careful parallel. She went about her routine with the efficiency of someone who had eliminated every unnecessary motion, over 400 days of practice, collecting the previous night's rain catchment, checking a series of small traps in the jungle perimeter, examining the tidal zone where she harvested certain shellfish at specific hours. Ethan followed at a respectful distance, observing. She was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. Not extraordinary in the way the women in his life had typically been, polished and strategic, excellent at rooms and cameras and first impressions designed to last. Lily was extraordinary the way a well-constructed system is extraordinary. Every element in its correct place, nothing wasted, the whole thing quietly and impressively functional. She'd been alone here for over a year, and she had not merely survived. She had built something. "You mapped the thermal currents in the cove," he said, noticing the marks on a flat piece of bark tacked to the interior wall of her shelter, a detailed diagram of water movement, labeled in careful handwriting. "Because when you understand the current patterns, you can predict where edible species will aggregate," she said without looking up. "It also tells you when the water temperature drops enough to affect swimming safety." "You swim out there?" "Occasionally, when I need to check the reef." She picked up a notebook from the shelf, a real one, waterproofed by being wrapped in layers of leaf material sealed with tree resin. "I've been documenting the reef ecosystem since I arrived, behavioral changes in several coral species, recovery patterns following the bleaching event 2 seasons ago." He looked at her. "You've been doing research." "I'm a marine biologist," she said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something that should be obvious. "I do research. It's what I do. On a deserted island, alone, with no equipment." She opened the notebook and he caught a glimpse of dense, precise handwriting and careful line-drawn diagrams. "Observation is equipment," she said. "The rest is just tools." He was quiet for a moment. "Where were you before the island?" She closed the notebook. "Scripps Institution of Oceanography," she said. "Senior researcher. I had a lab, a team, 3 active grants." She paused. Past tense. "What happened?" The question sat in the air between them. She resealed the notebook in its waterproof wrapping with deliberate care. "That," she said, "is a long story. We have time." She looked at him steadily. "We don't know each other. We're the only 2 people on an island in the middle of the Pacific," he said. "We might be the only 2 people who exist, as far as the current laws of this particular reality are concerned." A pause. Something moved in her expression. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. That's a dramatic way to ask someone their business. I've been told I'm dramatic. I believe it. She stood, brushing sand from her hands. Help me with the signal first, then we'll see. They worked on the North Beach through the heat of midday, rearranging his signal structure under her critical and not entirely unkind direction. She had opinions about everything: the angle of the rocks relative to typical aerial search patterns, the contrast ratio between his chosen materials and the surrounding sand, the fact that he'd positioned the whole construction in a section of beach partially obscured from the southwest approach by a cliff face. You should have built it 20 feet to the right, she said. I've been here 96 days, he said. When were you planning to mention that? Around day 100, she said, with perfect equanimity. He stopped, looked at her. You're serious. She looked back at him without apology. I told you I had reasons. He wanted to push. He didn't. Something about the way she said it, the flat, honest acknowledgement that her reasons existed and were real, kept him from pressing. He'd met a lot of people who deflected uncomfortable questions. Lily Harper didn't deflect. She simply declined. The difference mattered more than he could immediately explain. By mid-afternoon, the signal had been repositioned and significantly improved. It was a better signal. That irritated him slightly and impressed him considerably more. What about the merger? She asked, without looking up from the rock she was placing. He blinked. What? The Coal Meridian merger. The one you were celebrating when the storm hit. She set the rock down. How does a deal that size move forward without the CEO? My COO handles daily operations. The board can manage. He paused. Why do you know about the merger? I told you. I researched you when I realized you were here. She picked up another rock. You were everywhere in business coverage, hard to miss. Most people in that position would have found me immediately, he said. Use the contact. A connection back to the world. She glanced up at him. I had a satellite phone, Ethan. I could have called anyone. I chose not to. Why? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the signal. Long story, she said quietly. He watched her work. Her hands were capable and marked by small, honest scars. The hands of someone who had learned things the hard way and hadn't asked for easier alternatives. He thought, involuntarily, about Victoria's hands. Always perfectly maintained, always gesturing toward something she wanted. Very different hands. My fiancée, he said more to himself than to her. She was on the yacht when it went down. I don't know if She's fine, Lily said immediately. Then she caught herself. He stared at her. How do you know that? A brief silence. The satellite phone had battery for 3 days, she said carefully. I monitored emergency broadcasts. The accident made news. The passenger list was confirmed. All 40 guests accounted for. She paused. I thought you'd want to know. He sat with that for a moment. All 40 guests safe. Victoria fine. The merger continuing in his absence. His entire life proceeding without him, barely disrupted. It should have been reassuring. It was, mostly. But underneath it, something quieter, something he didn't look at too directly. Thank you, he said. She nodded and returned to the signal. That evening, she showed him how to build a better fire, hotter, cleaner, using half the material he'd been burning through for months. She corrected his technique without condescension, which he found disarming. He was accustomed to people either deferring to him entirely or competing with him openly. Lily did neither. She operated at her own level and made space for him to meet her there if he was capable. He was, it turned out, capable. You mentioned 3 active grants, he said, watching the fire settle. That's serious funding. Marine biology research at that level. Who was backing it? She was quiet. Lily. A private foundation, initially, she said. Later, a corporation got involved. She watched the flames. That was where things went wrong. He waited. They didn't fund the research because they believed in it, she said. They funded it because they wanted the data. Specifically, I found a compound in a deep reef coral species. Unusual properties. The kind that pharmaceutical companies care very much about. She paused. I published a preliminary paper. I was careful. I documented everything meticulously. 3 months later, I discovered that someone had filed patents based on my unpublished data. My full data. Data that had never left my secured laboratory. The fire crackled between them. Someone stole your research, Ethan said. Someone stole 4 years of my work and patented it before I could publish. And when I tried to expose what had happened, she stopped. Let's say the response was swift and forceful. He looked at her profile in the firelight. The steadiness of it, the complete absence of self-pity in the way she told it. "So you came here," he said. "I needed to disappear," she confirmed. "To think, to figure out what I had and what I needed to do with it." She looked up at him, and for the first time there was something unguarded in her expression, just a brief flash of it, like light through a crack in a wall that's been sealed a long time. "I wasn't supposed to stay this long. What kept you?" She looked back at the fire. "Fear," she said simply without shame. "And something else. The research I've been doing here. It's better than anything I did in the lab. Being here, really here, with nothing between me and the data." She almost smiled. "Funny how losing everything makes you better at the one thing you have left." He said nothing. There was nothing yet to say to that. Later, when the fire had burned low and the stars had come fully out in their unobstructed Pacific density, more stars than he'd ever seen, even after 96 nights, he noticed the box. It sat in the corner of her shelter, partially covered by a folded piece of fabric, lashed shut with a loop of vine. Small, perhaps the size of a shoebox. Waterproof, clearly, with a reinforced seam he could see from here. Everything else in her shelter was practical and accessible, arranged with functional logic. That box was different. It was protected. He looked at it once, quickly, and looked away. But he noticed. And noticing, he understood, was the beginning of something. What the storm reveals 1 week. It was enough time to learn a person's rhythms without learning their reasons. Ethan had moved his camp to the eastern side of the island, closer to Lily's setup, with access to the hidden cove that proved, as she had known all along, to be superior in every practical way. Better water, better wind protection, better horizon visibility in 3 directions. Moving had cost him half a day's effort and a small but measurable amount of pride. He'd gotten over both. Their routines had settled into an unspoken arrangement. Mornings were individual, afternoons were joint projects, evenings were somewhere in the middle, sometimes quiet, sometimes not. He'd learned more in 7 days than he had in the previous 89, and he wasn't entirely sure whether that was her instruction or his own accelerating competence, or simply the galvanizing effect of having someone worth proving something to. Not that he was proving anything. "You're holding it wrong," she said, not looking up from her own work. "I'm holding it the way it makes sense to hold it. And the vine isn't tightening the way it needs to. Hence, holding it wrong." He adjusted his grip on the branch he was attempting to lash into the shelter framework. The vine tightened correctly. He said nothing. She said. "Don't say I didn't say anything. You said which is the auditory equivalent of a pointed look." She did look up then, and the expression on her face was one he was beginning to recognize. The almost smile that acknowledged something had landed without conceding full territory to amusement. "You're sensitive for a billionaire. Former billionaire, technically. My assets are probably frozen pending death declaration." He considered this. "That's a strange thing to be casual about. Probably takes some adjustment," she agreed, in the tone of someone who knew something about adjusting to things they'd never planned for. He watched her hands work, the efficiency of them, the total absence of wasted motion that he'd found himself studying more than was strictly necessary. She was teaching him fire technique, shelter construction, tidal reading, plant identification, knot work. She taught the way she did most things, by demonstration, by calm correction, and by expecting him to be capable of learning. No condescension, no performance. Just the transfer of knowledge between 2 people on equal footing. It was, he realized, the most genuinely useful he'd felt in years. "What was your lab like?" he asked. She considered it, hands still moving. "Big windows over the water. I always needed to see the ocean even when I was working. My colleagues thought it was a quirk. I thought it was a requirement." She paused. "I had a PhD student, Mara. Brilliant. She was going to do better work than me eventually. I knew it, and I was glad about it." A quieter pause. "I hope she found another advisor. Someone good." "She probably did," Ethan said, and then caught himself. Lily looked at him sharply. "The satellite phone," he said. "I assumed." "You assumed," she said slowly, "because you needed something to say." "Yes," he admitted. A beat. "Don't do that," she said, not unkindly. "Don't tell me things are okay when you don't actually know. I'd rather have the honest version. Most people prefer comfort over accuracy. Most people haven't been lied to the way I have." She returned to her work. "I'll take accuracy every time." He filed that away carefully, the way you file away something that matters. The afternoon of their 8th day together brought the first real test. They'd gone out separately, he to check the north signal, she to the reef, and he returned to find the stream running fast and dark, the western sky a color he'd learned over 3 months to read as warning. By the time he reached the eastern camp, the wind had picked up to the point that standing upright required effort. "Flash storm," Lily said, already moving with the efficient urgency of someone who had done this before. She was pulling her most critical items into waterproofed bags with the precise speed of a practiced routine. "The cove floods from the back channel when there's heavy rainfall. The shelter's on high ground, but we need everything elevated immediately." "How long do we have?" She scanned the western horizon. 20 minutes, possibly less. They moved without discussion. She directed and he followed, which he found to his genuine surprise entirely natural, his instinct to assert direction dissolving in the face of the simple, obvious fact that she knew this place and this situation in ways he didn't. The notebooks went first, then the constructed equipment, the food stores, and finally, with deliberate bodily care, the waterproof box, which she tucked into a shoulder bag she wore pressed against her side for the full duration of what followed. The storm hit the way Pacific flash storms do. No warning crescendo, just immediate, total, overwhelming noise. Rain so heavy it turned the air white. Wind that made conversation impossible at distance. The cove became a percussion instrument. Visibility dropped to 20 feet. They sheltered on the high rock shelf above the camp, a natural overhang that Lily had clearly used before, stocked with a rolled waterproof covering she deployed in seconds with the muscle memory of long practice. They sat close. The overhang required it. "Does this happen often?" he asked, raising his voice over the white noise. 3 or 4 times a season, she said. She had the shoulder bag on her lap, both hands resting on it. "It always passes quickly. The violence is the point. It comes hard, and then it's done." They sat in the roar of it, close enough that he was aware of the warmth of her arm against his. Neither of them moved away. Below them, the cove floor disappeared under a sheet of moving water, the lower rocks vanishing entirely. "Tell me about the man who stole your research," he said. She was quiet for a moment that had nothing to do with not hearing him. "His name isn't something I'll say yet," she said. "Why not?" "Because names have weight, and I'm not ready to put that weight in this specific conversation." She watched the flooding cove. "He's connected to a very large pharmaceutical operation. He used the foundation money as a method of accessing academic researchers, funding grants as a way of inserting himself into ownership of the resulting intellectual property. I wasn't the only researcher he targeted. I was simply the one who found out early enough to do something about it." The rain hammered the rock above them. Ethan listened. "When I found out and began asking questions, things moved very quickly," she continued. "My lab was broken into. My original notebooks disappeared from a locked office. A formal misconduct investigation was opened. Against me." She said it with the even, factual tone of someone who had long ago processed the rage and arrived somewhere colder and more useful. Suddenly, I was the one accused of fabricating data. Suddenly, my grant history was under scrutiny. Suddenly, anonymous correspondence was reaching my department chair about my professional integrity. "They flipped the whole thing onto you," Ethan said. "Completely. I had evidence. Not enough yet, not a complete chain, but enough to know what had happened and enough to know that waiting quietly meant losing everything before I had a chance to act." She paused. "So I didn't wait quietly. I came here. To buy time." "To buy time," she confirmed. "To put distance between myself and whatever came next. To work out what I had, what I needed, and what I was going to do with it." She looked at the bag on her lap. "And to protect this." He looked at the box through the bag's fabric. "What's in it?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him sideways. That careful, scientific assessment she deployed before deciding whether something warranted trust. "Why do you want to know?" "Because you held it against your body through a flash storm," he said. "So it's either the most important thing you own or something you love. Either way, I'm curious." The almost smile appeared, fuller this time, with something almost like warmth in it. Most people wouldn't separate those two categories. Most people haven't had 96 days to learn the difference between them. The rain was easing. Incrementally, reluctantly, the percussion losing urgency. "It's the evidence," she said. "Copies of my original data, encrypted drives, lab logs with timestamps that predate the patent filings by years. A chain of documentation I managed to preserve before everything else was taken." She paused. "If I can get it to the right people, a contact at the EPA, another at the FDA, there are regulatory bodies that would care very much about what I found." Because if that compound moves toward clinical application without proper vetting, without the full picture of what it actually does at depth, she stopped. People could be hurt. That's the part that kept me going when fear told me to stay hidden forever. The rain stopped. The abrupt, total silence of a past Pacific storm, the kind that always feels too sudden, the world forgetting to ease the transition. The cove below them was wet and gleaming, late sun breaking through dissolving cloud and turning everything improbable and golden. A bird called once. Then again, as if testing whether it was safe, they were still sitting close. Neither of them had moved. Ethan was very aware of that. He was also aware, with the sharpened attention of someone who had learned to read environments closely, that she was watching him with a question in her expression that she hadn't asked yet. "Say what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "that a CEO of your specific profile has very particular industry connections, and that the people I've been dealing with move in certain circles." A pause. "I'm thinking it may not be entirely coincidental that the storm that sank your yacht found you in an area you wouldn't normally have been." He looked at her. "The engagement party," he said slowly. "We were 30 miles off the standard route. Victoria suggested the course change, said she wanted to watch the sunset from a specific heading. Lily said nothing. She held his gaze with that level, blue-eyed attention that didn't flinch. Something cold moved through him. He pushed it aside, not because it wasn't important, but because he needed to be careful. He needed to understand before he reacted. "You said you researched me when you had the satellite phone," he said. "Yes. What specifically did you find?" She reached into the shoulder bag and opened the waterproof box. He had one brief impression of neat, carefully sealed documents and small drive casings before she withdrew a photograph, water-stained at the edges but clear in its center. She handed it to him. He looked at it and stopped breathing. The man in the photograph was smiling at a formal event, a gala of some kind, well-lit and expensive. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that made rooms arrange themselves around him, the kind of man who had long ago stopped being aware of his own authority because it had become as automatic as breathing. Ethan knew that face. He knew it because he'd shaken that hand 3 weeks before the storm. He knew it because that man had sat across from him in the coal industry's boardroom and discussed the terms of the merger with the easy confidence of someone who knew how things would end. He knew it because that man's signature was on the partnership agreement that was supposed to define the next decade of Ethan's company. Raymond Hollis, the man who had stolen Lily Harper's research and dismantled her life, was the same man who had just become Ethan Cole's most important business partner. He looked up from the photograph. Lily was watching him with the careful steadiness of someone who already knew what he was about to say, who had been waiting for this moment, he realized, since the night she'd first decided to let him find her. "You know," he said, "I found the merger announcement when I had the phone," she said quietly. "That was when I understood you weren't just a stranded stranger passing through." She held his gaze. "And that was when I had to decide whether you were safe to trust or whether you were part of it." The sun was going down over the western water. The cove was quiet and gold and completely, absolutely isolated from the world that contained Raymond Hollis and Victoria Ashford, and a merger agreement that now meant something entirely different than it had 3 hours ago. "And," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, the full weight of 412 days of careful, hard-won judgment behind her eyes. "And," she said, "I showed you the photograph." The photograph stayed between them longer than was comfortable. That was how Ethan knew it was serious. Not because of the information, but because neither of them rushed past it. There was no impulse to fill the silence with strategy or explanation, or the kind of decisive executive noise he normally used to establish control over a situation. He simply sat with what he was looking at, and Lily sat with him, and the cove went dark around them in the careful, incremental way that dusk works when there's no electricity competing with it. Raymond Hollis. He could reconstruct the whole timeline of their professional relationship from memory now, and every element of it looked different. The foundation approach 18 months ago, a formal introduction through a mutual contact on the Harvard Endowment Board, framed as philanthropic interest in technology's intersection with environmental science, the gradual deepening of the connection, the merger proposal which had arrived not from coal industry's side but from Hollis, carefully packaged as a natural evolution. Ethan had considered himself a sophisticated reader of people. He did not say that to Lily. "He came to me," he said instead. "The merger was his idea from the beginning. I thought I was the one who stood to gain. I built the whole thing in my mind as a deal I'd earned." "He lets people feel that way," Lily said. It's a technique. You feel like the advantaged party in every exchange, which means you're not watching for the thing he's actually extracting. 4 years of your research, and a very clean patent portfolio worth a considerable amount once the compound enters clinical trials. Her voice was even, precise, stripped of the emotion the facts warranted. Orodyne 7, that's what they've named it. Phase 2 trials are underway. If I'm right about the full-depth behavioral profile of the compound in living reef systems, there are contraindications that nobody on those trials is currently aware of. How bad? Potentially serious. Nothing I can prove without the supporting data being properly evaluated by independent researchers. But enough that people in certain regulatory positions should be asking questions that no one is asking. She looked at him. Now you understand why this box exists. Why I've been here. You weren't hiding, he said slowly. I was building a case, she corrected. Hiding was a side effect. He handed the photograph back. She replaced it with the careful deliberateness of someone handling the most important object they own. The merger, he said. If Hollis has been working toward it systematically, what does he gain from coal industries specifically? Your government contracts, she said without hesitation. Coal Industries has defense and environmental monitoring contracts with 3 federal agencies. Those channels are very useful if you need peer-reviewed cover for a compound that can't fully withstand independent scrutiny. The institutional credibility transfers. She paused. He doesn't need your money, Ethan. He needs your name on a letterhead. He sat with that. It was the kind of information that reoriented a large amount of history very rapidly, the way certain geographical revelations do, when you discover that the territory you thought you understood is arranged completely differently than your map suggested. Victoria, he said. Lily was quiet. She suggested the course change before the storm, he said. She knew the forecast. She has a close relationship with 3 members of my board. He paused. How long have they been working together? I don't have that, she said honestly. I have Hollis clearly. Victoria Ashford as a connected possibility. The rest is inference. But your inference is that the storm wasn't weather. She met his gaze. I think you were becoming inconvenient. The merger was done. The paperwork signed. The announcement made. A CEO who becomes a navigational problem after the deal closes is easier to manage if he's no longer part of the equation. A pause. That's inference. I want to be clear. It's very good inference. I've had 400 days to think. He stood and walked to the edge of the rock shelf, looking out at the black water. The stars were dense overhead, the kind of sky that makes the world feel both enormous and legible. Everything where it is, everything showing its position. He thought about the 40 guests confirmed safe. He thought about the Coast Guard response timeline, which had been faster than it should have been for an unmarked stretch of Pacific, almost as if someone had known where to look. He thought about the merger going forward without him, smoothly, unbothered by his absence. He thought about Victoria's hands, that last night on the yacht, how they'd rested on his arm, the practiced quality of it. If I get off this island, he said, everything I touch goes directly to Hollis through the merger structure. My people, my data, my government relationships. And if I go back unannounced, before anyone knows I'm alive, you have the element of surprise, Lily said. Once. He turned around. We have it. She looked at him carefully. I work alone. You've been working alone on this island for over a year, and nothing has moved yet. He said it without cruelty, directly and honestly the way she had asked him to speak. You have evidence, I have access. My COO is a man I've trusted for 15 years and he's not part of this. I'm certain of that. My corporate attorney owes me a significant personal debt. And I know people at the FDA who pick up when I call. She held his gaze for a long moment. You'd walk away from the merger, she said. The deal you built your entire company toward. I'd be walking away from Hollis, he said. The merger was never what I thought it was. It would cost you. Lily. He held her gaze directly. No strategy in it. Nothing calculated. Tell me what you need. She looked at him for a long time with the full serious weight of those blue eyes. The kind of looking that has no performance in it. The kind that's actually trying to read something true. He let her look. He had nothing to hide, which was a novel and surprisingly clean feeling. Time, she finally said. And a contact at the EPA Coastal Division. Someone outside Hollis's reach. I have someone, he said. A pause. I'll think about it, she said. Which, he was learning, meant yes. The following 2 weeks were the most honest of his life, and also the most difficult, and the two facts were not unrelated. Lily was not easy company in the ways that company is typically easy. She didn't soften information to protect his feelings, didn't defer to his assessment of situations, didn't manage him. She disagreed directly and without apology when she disagreed. She expected him to hold up his end of every shared task and held him to standards she applied equally to herself. She also, in the late evenings by the fire, sometimes talked, really talked, in a way he hadn't experienced since he was young enough not to know how rare it was. About her parents, who were both oceanographers, who had raised her on coastlines and made her feel that the sea was the most natural place to be. About her sister in Portland, who didn't know where she was and who she missed with a physical ache she'd learned to function through rather than around. About the day she'd found the anomalous data in the coral samples, the specific morning, the specific reading, the quality of the light through the lab windows, and how her first feeling hadn't been excitement, but a kind of weight, a sense that what she'd found was going to cost her something she couldn't yet see. She was right about that too. He told her about his father. He hadn't talked about his father in years. Not the real version, not the version that included the board meeting he hadn't attended, the call he'd let go to voicemail, the choices that could not be unmade. Lily listened the way she did most things, completely, without flinching, without rushing to the comfort that would have let him stop before the part that actually mattered. He said the part that actually mattered. It felt like pulling something out of a wound, painful in a way that was also unmistakably the beginning of healing. On a Tuesday, 18 days after they'd first spoken, she came back from the reef with mud on her hands and something sharp in her expression. He was repairing a section of the shelter and he stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" "The eastern reef," she said. Her voice was controlled in the specific way that it got when she was suppressing strong emotion. Not flat, but held carefully. "There's a new bleaching event starting at the 40-foot depth. Exactly the species profile I documented. Exactly the pattern that corresponds with what I found in the compound behavior data." She stopped. "The trials are already having an effect. Something is reaching the water system and the species are responding." He understood what that meant. "How fast is this moving?" he said. "Faster than I projected, which means the compound is in broader distribution than Phase 2 trials alone should account for." Her jaw tightened. "Someone is moving this toward market faster than the official timeline shows. Hollis. He's accelerating." She met his eyes. "We're not out of time yet, but we're not as far from it as I thought." That night was the first night neither of them slept much. They sat on the high rock shelf above the cove working through what Lily had. The case she'd built was thorough, meticulous, and missing exactly one element, a confirmed chain of custody linking Hollis to the theft. She had the data, she had the timestamps, she had the patent filings. What she couldn't yet prove was the mechanism, the specific point at which her secured data had been accessed and extracted. "Who had access to your lab?" Ethan asked. "My team, my department head, 2 members of the Foundation Oversight Committee." She paused. "And 1 person Hollis inserted as a visiting researcher during the final year of the grant period. I didn't question it then. I was focused on the work." "Name?" She said it. Ethan pulled from memory the way he did when the stakes were high enough to make everything sharp. He turned the name over, connected it, cross-referenced. "He's employed by a consulting firm that Hollis uses for IP management," he said. "I saw the name in the merger due diligence documents. It seemed like a small detail." Lily stared at him. "You have that documented," she said very carefully. "My attorney has copies of all merger documents," Ethan said, "including the full vendor and consultant lists. If that name appears in both your timeline and my merger records, that's the chain," she said. Her voice was quiet and very still. "That's the chain," he confirmed. The wind came off the water. The stars turned overhead the way they had every night for months, indifferent and beautiful and ancient. Somewhere out there was Raymond Hollis, moving fast, certain that his problems were solved. Lily looked at Ethan with something he hadn't seen from her yet. Not the scientific assessment, not the careful wariness, not the controlled steadiness of someone managing very old fear. Something rawer than all of those. "I've been alone with this for a very long time," she said. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a plea. It was just the honest, precise truth, stated the way she stated things, directly without embellishment, trusting the other person to understand its full weight. He did understand it. "Not anymore," he said. She looked at him for another long moment, and then she nodded. Once, slowly, the kind of nod that means more than agreement. The kind that means, I'm going to trust this, and I understand what that cost me, and I'm choosing it anyway. The fire between them burned down to coals, and neither of them moved to rebuild it. The dark that settled was not uncomfortable. It was the particular dark of two people who have arrived at the same place from very different directions, and who have recognized, without quite saying it yet, that they are not in a hurry to be anywhere else. Everything the island kept rescue came on a Wednesday, at 9:30 in the morning, in the form of a Coast Guard helicopter that had been redirected by an anonymous tip to a search grid nobody had previously checked. The tip had come from a satellite distress beacon, old model, low signal, the kind that shows up as noise in most automated monitoring systems. Lily had found it in the first week, washed up in the debris field of a previous storm, and had kept it without activating it for reasons she'd never fully explained. She activated it on the morning of day 119, 23 days after Ethan arrived at the Eastern Cove, and when the helicopter came, she stood on the high rock with her shoulder bag pressed against her side and watched it descend without the expression of a person being rescued. She had the expression of a person executing the next phase of a plan. Ethan understood, watching her, that for Lily the island had never been the crisis. The island was the preparation. What came next was the crisis. The Coast Guard medics were professional and thorough, and entirely unprepared for two survivors in better physical condition than most people who report to the office on a regular Monday. Ethan had lost 20 pounds and gained something harder to name in exchange, a quality of presence that one of the medics noticed without being able to articulate. The second medic noticed that the woman kept one hand on a shoulder bag through the entire examination and didn't leave it unguarded for a single moment. They didn't ask about it. Good instincts. The flight to Honolulu took 40 minutes. Ethan used the first 5 to orient, the next 5 to locate his priorities, and the remaining 30 to begin making calls that would not wait. The medics, to their credit, recognized the precise moment when a rescue subject transforms into an executive and stepped back accordingly. First call, Marcus Webb, COO of Coal Industries, 15-year relationship. The call lasted 90 seconds and contained information that made Marcus go very quiet on his end in the way that only extremely significant information produces. I need you to do nothing, Ethan said. Specifically, nothing that Hollis or anyone connected to him can see coming. Pull all merger documents. Full archive. Send everything to Thomas Riley's encrypted server tonight. Ethan, Marcus's voice was very controlled. I'm fine. I'll explain everything. Is the merger finalized? Signatures exchanged. 30-day integration period begins next week. Pause everything you can pause without triggering notification clauses. I'll explain why tonight. A beat. Trust me. Always have, Marcus said. Second call. Thomas Riley, corporate attorney. Shorter, equally decisive. Thomas had the kind of mind that processed complex information at speed and then went immediately to action, which was why Ethan had retained him for 11 years and overpaid him consistently and without complaint. The Hollis consulting firm roster, Ethan said. I need a specific name cross-referenced against all merger documents. He gave the name. Thomas was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. That name appears in 3 places in the due diligence archive, he said. I flagged it as a potential conflict during review. You told me to proceed. I know, Ethan said. I was wrong. Find me the documentation chain. Everything that name touches. I need it complete before I land. Lily sat across from him during these calls, watching the water far below through the helicopter window. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. He could feel her attention from across the cabin, present and focused and trusting him to do what he said he would do, which was, he was aware, the most significant thing she could offer a person. Honolulu. Hospital clearance. A hotel suite booked by Marcus's assistant within the hour. 2 rooms, Ethan noted with a quiet respect for logistics. Lily stood in the hotel room and looked at it for a long moment. The white linen, the climate control, the bathroom with actual running water, the room service menu on the desk. She touched the edge of the bed with 2 fingers, then turned and opened her shoulder bag on the desk with the careful, practiced movements of a scientist preparing to work. Ethan appeared in the doorway between the rooms. When did you last sleep in an actual bed? She considered. 433 days ago. Would you like to do that first before? No. She was already opening the waterproof box, setting the drives and documents out in the order she'd clearly maintained in her head for over a year. There's a reef bleaching event that's outpacing my projections and a compound in Phase 2 trials that needs regulatory attention. Sleep is for after. He looked at her in the afternoon light of the hotel room, her island clothes, her careful hands, the absolute quiet intensity she brought to everything, and felt something so direct and complete that it took his full executive self-control not to say it immediately. He stepped back into his room and called his contact at the FDA instead. The next 48 hours were the most concentrated of Ethan's professional life, and he had lived a professional life that contained some extremely concentrated periods. Lily's evidence was extraordinary, not just complete but beautiful in the way that very good science is beautiful. The documentation so precise and cross-referenced that his attorney said, on reviewing it, that he had never in 20 years of corporate law seen a case assembled with this quality of rigor by a person working alone. She built this on an island, Ethan said, with no equipment. Thomas Riley paused. Tell me more about her, he said. Later, Ethan said. The moment that changed everything came on hour 31, in a conference room at the FDA's regional office in Honolulu, with 2 senior investigators and a data forensics specialist from the EPA's Coastal Division, Ethan's contact, who had cleared his calendar the moment Ethan called. Lily presented her case in a room for the first time since the night everything was taken from her. Ethan had watched her in many contexts on the island, teaching, building, thinking, surviving. He had not yet seen her in a room like this, doing the things she was actually made for. The transformation was not dramatic. She didn't become louder or more expansive or perform expertise. She simply became completely herself, without any of the containment the island had required. She was devastating. By the time she'd walked through the data, the timestamps, the cross-referenced consulting firm records that Ethan's attorney had provided, and the reef bleaching documentation with its direct correlation to compound distribution patterns, by that point, one of the FDA investigators had already made a quiet call from the hallway that Ethan understood, from long experience reading rooms, was not a casual one. The trial was paused by administrative order that evening, pending investigation, quietly, professionally, without public announcement. The kind of pause that, once initiated, does not uninitiate. Lily came out of that room and stood in the hallway outside and breathed, for about 30 seconds very carefully, not visibly emotional, but her hands at her sides were pressed flat against her thighs with a force that spoke of everything. She was not letting her face show. Ethan stood beside her and said nothing. He'd learned across 119 days exactly when she needed words and when she needed space and when she needed someone simply to stand with her while she processed a large thing privately. This was the third kind. After 30 seconds, she turned to him. The reef data, she said. They're going to want an independent survey. I'll fund it, he said. She looked at him steadily. That's a significant commitment. I know what I'm committing to. He held her gaze, and there was nothing in his expression that was not exactly what it appeared to be. She looked at him for a long time. Ethan, she said quietly. Lily, this is... She stopped, looked at her hands, looked back at him. I don't know how to do this part, she said, the trusting someone part I used to know. And then I learned very thoroughly what it costs, and She stopped again. I know, he said. You don't. Fully. You can't. No, he agreed. But I know enough, and I'm not going anywhere. She held his gaze. The hallway was quiet. Somewhere below them, the Pacific moved against the coast the way it always does. Without urgency, without apology, without any concern for human timelines. I need to call my sister, she said, and her voice cracked. Precisely once, briefly, the one place in her armor that 3 days of the real world had found. She recovered immediately and completely, and the fact that she'd allowed it even for a second in front of him told him more than a long conversation would have. He handed her his phone. She walked 10 steps down the hallway and stood with her back to him, and he heard her say her sister's name, and he turned and looked at the wall and gave her that. Raymond Hollis was taken into federal custody 36 hours later, at his estate in La Jolla, by investigators who arrived at 7 in the morning with documentation he did not know existed. His attorney had him out on bail by afternoon. That was fine. The process that had started was not one that bail could pause. Ethan had made sure of that, personally and with considerable thoroughness. Victoria Ashford was reached by federal investigators in Seattle, where she had returned after the yacht accident with Ethan's death presumed, and the merger proceeding smoothly. The conversation was recorded. She cooperated with a speed that confirmed more clearly than anger could have exactly how fully her involvement had been calculated. Whatever she'd told herself about Ethan Cole, it had not been love. He'd known that somewhere, for longer than he'd admitted. The island had simply given him 100 days of silence in which to finish knowing it. He felt nothing about Victoria that resembled grief. He noted that honestly, and filed it away. What he felt, what had been building steadily, over weeks of shared fires and shared work and shared honesty, that stripped away every version of himself that he'd constructed for the world, that was something else entirely. Something he hadn't felt since before the company, before the portfolio, before the identity he'd confused for so long with the person inside it. He found Lily on the hotel room balcony that night, looking at the ocean. She'd showered, and her hair was down, clean and still slightly damp, and she was wearing a hotel robe with the slightly self-conscious air of someone reacclimating to softness. She looked simultaneously more fragile and more formidable than she had on the island, which was a combination he'd never encountered before, and found he was having a very direct physical response to. He stood in the doorway. "My sister is flying in tomorrow," she said without turning. "Good," he said. She cried for about 15 minutes on the phone. "Understandable." "I did not cry," she said with dignity. "Of course not." A pause. "I may have slightly cried. I didn't hear anything." She turned then and looked at him across the balcony, and the ocean was behind her and the city was below and the moon was doing something entirely unfair with the light, and he walked across to her and stopped when he was close enough to make the question clear but not close enough to have answered it without permission. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "With any of this, the island made sense here. Here makes sense too," he said. "Different sense, but sense." She looked up at him. "You're very certain for someone who just spent 100 days eating coconuts." "The coconuts gave me perspective," he said. She laughed. A real one. Sudden and genuine. The kind that has no calculation in it. The kind that breaks open a face and shows you exactly who's living behind it. He had never heard her laugh like that. Entirely unguarded, and it moved through him like weather. "Lily," he said. "I know," she said. He kissed her. And she kissed him back with the full, certain force of someone who had thought very carefully about a decision, and was no longer hesitating about it, which was, in his experience, the best possible kind of kiss. The Pacific moved against the coast below them. The moon continued being unreasonable. Neither of them went inside for a very long time. The life we build. 6 months later, Seattle. The coal industry's boardroom had been updated since Ethan last sat in it. New chairs, new configuration. One conspicuous absence where Raymond Hollis's signed portrait had apparently been removed with enough force that the wall required repainting. The paint was slightly newer in that rectangle. Ethan noted it without expression and took his seat at the head of the table for the first time in 8 months. Marcus Webb sat to his right, Thomas Riley to his left. The rest of the board, minus 2 members who had resigned during the investigation period, quickly and without elegantly explaining why, arranged themselves with the careful energy of people who weren't certain what version of their CEO had returned from the Pacific. They were right to be uncertain. The version that came back was not the one that had left. "The Hollis merger is dissolved," Ethan said. "Federal courts issued the final order last week. All assets and contracts revert to their pre-merger status. Coal Industries absorbs no liability from the Oridyne 7 trial investigations because we were never functionally part of that operation, regardless of what the paperwork implied." He looked around the table. "Thomas will walk you through the restructuring proposal. It's comprehensive, it's clean, and it represents what this company should have been building toward for the last 5 years." Marcus caught his eye briefly. The small nod of a man who had trusted his instincts about another person for 15 years and been, every time, right. Raymond Hollis was awaiting trial on charges that included intellectual property theft, securities fraud, and interference with federal regulatory processes. His attorney was very good. The evidence was better. Lily had built a case that 4 years of determined isolation had rendered essentially airtight, and Ethan had provided the corporate documentation that completed the chain. The pharmaceutical compound had been pulled from trials pending a full independent review, funded, at Ethan's initiative, by a grant administered through Coal Industries' newly established Marine Research Foundation. The review team included 3 independent researchers from Scripps, 2 EPA coastal specialists, and a lead investigator who had been identified and recruited by the Foundation's new scientific director, Dr. Lily Harper, formerly of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, currently of wherever the work required her to be, which was sometimes a laboratory and sometimes a reef system, and sometimes a boardroom and sometimes, increasingly, Seattle. Her reputation had been formally rehabilitated by a joint statement from Scripps and the Foundation that had originally funded her research. The statement issued after the consulting firm's role in the data theft became part of the public legal record. Her original paper had been submitted, under her name alone, to the journal that had been about to publish the stolen version. It was accepted within 3 weeks. Mara Chen, her former PhD student, had completed her doctoral work under a different advisor and was now heading her own lab in San Diego. She called Lily on the day the rehabilitation statement went public and spoke for 45 minutes, and Lily came out of that call with red eyes she didn't explain and a quality of looseness in her shoulders that had never been there before. Victoria Ashford had cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge that carried no prison time, but ended her career in any industry adjacent to coal industries or Hollis's network, which was most of the relevant industries. She had moved to London. Ethan had not heard from her and did not expect to. He wished her nothing specific. The 2 board members who resigned had done so, Thomas informed him, the morning Ethan's survival was announced, a timing that answered several questions he'd been asking himself since Honolulu. The investigation into their roles in the events surrounding the storm was ongoing. Ethan had provided everything he had and then deliberately turned his attention forward, because backward was a direction with limited useful territory once the important things were resolved. The boardroom meeting lasted 3 hours. It was the most focused, substantive session the Coal Industries Board had conducted in years. No performance, no politics, just the actual work of building something that made sense. Ethan ran it the way he'd learned to run things on the island, directly without unnecessary complexity, with full attention to what actually mattered and none to what only appeared to. Marcus noticed. "You're different," he said afterward, in the hallway. "Better or worse?" Marcus considered genuinely. "Harder to manage," he said. "Significantly better to work for." Ethan found Lily in the lobby, reading something on her laptop with the focused concentration that converted the immediate environment around her into pure background. She had a coffee she hadn't touched and a notepad covered in her precise handwriting, and the general air of someone who would be entirely fine if no one spoke to them for the next several hours. He sat beside her anyway. She glanced up. "How did it go?" "Board is aligned. Restructuring approved. Foundation charter finalized." She nodded and returned to her screen. "That's it? Just nod?" She looked up again, and this time the expression was the full version of the almost smile she'd been rationing on the island. Generous now, unguarded, lit from somewhere behind her eyes that had been dark for a long time and was not dark anymore. "You didn't need my assessment of a corporate board meeting. You needed me to be here when you came out of it." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I needed." She closed the laptop. "Are you done for the day?" "Completely. Then I want to show you something." She led him through the city to the waterfront, Elliott Bay at the end of October, the water gray-green and serious, mountains visible to the east through thin cloud. She stood at the railing above the water with her hair in the wind and her hands wrapped around the coffee she'd finally picked up, and she looked at the horizon with the focused, specific attention of a person who reads water for a living. "The EPA Coastal Division approved the expanded survey," she said. 3 reef systems across the Pacific. 18 months. I'd need to be offshore for significant portions of that time. "I know," he said. "That's complicated," she said. "For a lot of reasons. I know that too." She looked at him sideways. "You're being very understanding for someone who runs a company from one city." "I run a company," he said. "I don't have to run it from one place." He looked at the water beside her. "I've been thinking about that. The island was the first time in 15 years I stopped moving long enough to do the actual work, instead of performing the appearance of it. I think I can do that from a boat occasionally." She turned to look at him directly. "Ethan, you are not following me onto a research vessel. I learn fast," he said. "You said so yourself. I said you held the vine wrong, and then I held it right." She opened her mouth, closed it. The almost smile had become something larger, something that transformed her face into an open, luminous thing that he had first glimpsed by firelight on a dark island, and had been completely certain about ever since. "You're completely impossible," she said. "I've been told. The vessel is a 40-foot research catamaran," she said. "There is not a lot of space. I grew up in a studio apartment. I have range." She laughed. That real laugh, the unguarded one, the one that had ruined him completely the first time he heard it, and had not stopped ruining him since. He reached out and tucked her hair back from her face where the wind had blown it, and she let him, which was, from Lily, the equivalent of a declaration. "I love you," he said. He'd said it once before, on the hotel balcony in Honolulu 3 days after rescue, and she'd looked at him with the full weight of everything she'd learned about the cost of trust, and then she'd said it back, quietly and without hedging, and it had been the most serious moment of his adult life, and he had treated it accordingly. "I know," she said now simply, and then, "I love you too, even though you are going to be extremely inconvenient on a 40-foot research vessel. I'll learn to be convenient." "Unlikely. Probably," he agreed. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the railing above Elliott Bay in the October wind, and looked at the water together, a CEO who had gone to the ocean as one person and returned as another, and a scientist who had gone to the ocean to survive and found, against all strategic planning, something worth coming back for. 3 months after that, on a clear January morning at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, the place where Lily had first found the compound, first understood what it meant, first set in motion everything that followed, Ethan proposed. He'd considered many locations. He'd rejected approximately 30 of them for various reasons before arriving at the answer that had actually been obvious the entire time. It should be where her work began, where she had been, before everything was taken and then returned. The place that represented not what she'd survived but what she'd built. She was standing at the lab window she'd described on the island. Big windows, ocean view, the quality of light that had always felt to her like a requirement rather than a preference. She was reading something on a tablet. She had her hair up and her reading glasses on, and the expression of someone whose mind was elsewhere entirely in the best possible way. He walked in. She looked up. He did not make a speech. Lily did not require speeches. He took the ring from his pocket, a sapphire because obvious symbolism had its place, and looked at her and said, "I know what I'm asking. I know what it costs you to trust this. I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a long moment over the top of her reading glasses with the full, serious weight of the woman who had survived 433 days alone on an island by sheer intelligence and determination, who had built a case against a powerful man with nothing but rigor and patience, who had kissed him back on a hotel balcony in Honolulu, with the complete, decisive certainty of someone who had considered the matter thoroughly and was no longer hesitating. "Yes," she said. No hedging, no almost. The ocean moved outside the window exactly as it always had. The light did its thing. Somewhere in the building, Mara Chen was running an analysis in the lab 2 doors down and would be the first person, Lily told 40 seconds later, in the hallway, at a volume significantly above what either of them would later admit to. They married in April, on the coast. Small, real. Marcus Webb gave a toast that was funny and accurate, and notably free of the words synergy or paradigm shift, which Ethan considered the clearest evidence of genuine personal growth. Lily's sister Sarah cried, and didn't apologize for it. Mara Chen caught the bouquet and examined it with the expression of someone receiving a data point. Raymond Hollis was convicted in October of that year on all primary charges. The sentencing was covered briefly in Business News and at length in environmental science publications, which was the correct ratio. He said nothing in his statement that was true, which surprised no one. Victoria Ashford sent a card. Ethan read it once and put it aside and felt, with complete calm, that this was the appropriate response to it. The Oridine 7 compound, following independent review, was found to require significant reformulation before any clinical application. The reformulation process was estimated at 4 to 6 years. The original patent was declared void. Lily's foundational research was formally credited in the regulatory record and in 3 peer-reviewed papers that were published in the 12 months following the trial. On the research catamaran Harper, named by Ethan, who had presented the naming as non-negotiable, which had made Lily argue about it for 45 minutes before conceding. Ethan Cole learned to read title charts, manage marine sample collection, and be legitimately, non-performatively useful on a 40-foot research vessel in open Pacific water. He was not naturally gifted at it. He was, as Lily had told him once, about holding vines, capable of learning. On a clear morning in June, somewhere west of the Hawaiian archipelago, Lily surfaced from a dive with the quality of expression that meant she'd found something worth finding. She pulled herself onto the deck, pushed her mask up, and looked at the data recorder in her hand with the focused, private joy of a person whose life is the right life. Ethan handed her a towel. "Good dive?" he said. "Very," she said. The recovery in the secondary reef system is ahead of projection. The coral re-establishment at depth is—" She stopped and looked up at him, and the scientist's focus dissolved into something warmer and more personal. "It's good," she said simply. "It's really good." He looked at her, salt-wet and sunlit and at home in the middle of the Pacific in a way that was biological and ancient and real, and thought about a North Beach with a badly positioned signal fire, and a ridge he'd crossed on a Tuesday in the 96th day of the hardest year of his life, and footprints in the soft earth near a stream. The smallest decisions made without knowing what they mean. "Yes," he said. "It is." The boat moved on the water. The ocean went on in all directions, enormous and indifferent and full of things that were surviving and recovering and beginning again, the way things do when you give them enough time and enough care and enough of the right kind of attention. Neither of them needed to say anything else. They didn't. They